about my own panel. Actually, our next presentation in this panel, panel 1, is from Jerome Warren. And he's going to talk about Indigenous peoples and their contributions to our democracy. And then that will be followed by Morris Butch-Boson, who's going to talk about relationship between governance approaches and societal outcomes. Sorry. Okay. We are up for Jerome next.
So he's coming in remotely.
Yes. Tell me when you can see me, if you can see me.
Hello, Jerome.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I would have liked to have been there. Life and demands and health and other constraints have prevented me from actually being there. But perhaps next summer I'll probably find some time to visit the US, and I'd like to be involved in these discussions, which I think are very important. So that's just the preamble. Let me now get to the talk, and I know there's lots of content to come up, so I don't want to monopolize the time. So as Valerie introduced, I'm Jerome. I'm currently coming to you from Berlin. The Reichstag that Christy mentioned, Lowell mentioned, is actually right down the street here, not very far. But that's not my topic. So my topic is indigenous sources to extend, deepen, and realize American democracy, which I've posed as a question. So this is more, so to speak, an impulse to stimulate conversation and not any kind of conclusive scientific or analytical sort of framework. It's a conversation. So I start with these observations, and they're opinion polls from various polling organizations in the US about Americans' perspectives on their political institutions. And Lowell and Valerie have discussed these basically in their preamble just a moment ago. So basically, as you see here, New York Times, Siena poll, faith flags in US government, many voters want to upend the system. A majority of voters across nearly all demographic ideologies believe the system of government does not work. There is little trust in institutions like the Supreme Court, in the Congress, all these sorts of things. So 7 in 10 Americans say the country's in crisis, at risk of failing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to linger on these things, but of course it's an important element to this discussion. So mainly the question I think I would address is, why is this the case, and to what extent can different elements shed light on how to get out of this crisis, which is a very, very important question, as has been said. So I think there's a thesis that the United States has always had two souls. I think this is in part what Lowell was getting at. This is from a book by a German anarchist, Rudolf Rocker, who basically outlined a tradition of liberal and even radical American thought. And he concludes the book with a very interesting observation, saying that along with the great path-breaking currents of liberal thought that Lowell outlined, basically, with John Locke and others, there existed in this country, speaking about the United States, from the very beginning, a whole line of backward and manifestly reactionary tendencies whose influence on the spiritual development of American life should not be underestimated. Furthermore, he says these currents are by no means to be considered merely as a consequence of the great land monopoly of the developing capitalistic economy in this country, which came more and more into sharp collision with the principles of Jeffersonian democracy, but in fact, they were already apparent, as he argues, in the first period of America's colonization. They developed and gained strength during the Industrial Revolution. These tendencies were brought over from Europe, just as were Locke's ideas and English liberalism in general. So that's Rudolf Rocker. To contrast that with this perspective from a very recent book that just has been making the bestseller list in many countries, and it's been translated in a number of languages. You see it here in Japanese and Dutch and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber, the late David Graeber, and David Wengrow. And basically they say here this concern by European philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau with inequality. So basically, the terms equality and inequality only began to enter common currency in the early 17th century under the influence of natural law theory. And as they argue, natural law theory in turn arose largely in the course of debates about the moral and legal implications of Europe's discoveries in the New World. And they discuss Rousseau as one side of this coin, saying that today the popular version of this story is typically some updated variation on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's discourses on the origins and foundations of inequality among mankind. 1754, it was written. So they say, once upon a time, the story goes, we were hunter-gatherers living in a prolonged state of childlike innocence in tiny bands. These bands were egalitarian. They could be for the very reason that they were small. It was only after the agricultural revolution and then still more the rise of cities that this happy condition came to an end, according to Rousseau, ushering in civilization and the state, which also meant the appearance of written literature, science, and philosophy, but at the same time, almost everything bad in human life, patriarchy, standing armies, mass executions, and annoying bureaucrats demanding that we spend much of our lives feeling informed. So that's the happy to sad version of the story. As they say, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, of course, wrote the other version. Hobbes's Leviathan, as they argue, published in 1651, is in many ways the founding text of modern political theory. As they argue, it held that human beings, being the selfish creatures that they are, life in an original state of nature was in no sense innocent. It must instead have been solitary, poor, nasty, brutish. In short, as everyone knows this expression, basically a state of war with everybody fighting against everybody else. Insofar as there has been any progress from this benighted state of affairs, a Hobbesian would argue it has been largely due to exactly those repressive mechanisms that Rousseau was complaining about: governments, courts, bureaucracies, and police. So basically, both of these versions of the story are similar. It's the stages version of historical development, only that the coloring is, in Rousseau's version, the savage on the left would be happy, and the guy on the right with the hot dog stand would be sad, whereas in Hobbes's version, it would be inverted. Of course, a simplification. But basically, the idea is that Graeber and Wengrow and others say is that another story, in fact, is possible. They introduced what they call the Indigenous critique, saying that basically we're going to retell the story assuming that all parties in the interaction between Europeans and Native Americans, the conversations of the colonists and their indigenous interlocutors were adults, and that they at least occasionally listened to each other, resulting in even familiar histories suddenly beginning to look different. In fact, what they argue is that Indigenous Americans were not only confronted with strange foreigners, that they gradually developed, in fact, their own surprisingly consistent critiques of European institutions, but that, in fact, these critiques became to be taken quite seriously in Europe itself. As an example, they list Father Pierre Biard, a missionary theologian who basically in 1608 was assigned from France to evangelize the Algonquin-speaking Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. And basically, they didn't like each other, the French and the Mi'kmaq. And the Mi'kmaq thought of the French, you are always fighting and quarreling among yourselves. We live peaceably. You are envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, the Mi'kmaq, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor, and so on. And so the French, as they said, had more material possessions, but in fact, the Mi'kmaq considered themselves richer than the French because they had other greater assets: ease, comfort, and time. And very quickly, just to relate this to David Ellerman's recent publication, Neo-Abolitionism, where he also is very critical of the natural law theory, suggesting this distinction between consent and coercion is not the right one, but we should be talking about translation versus concession. And in fact, this is what one could frame the Native American mindset of, but I don't have enough time to talk about that. So again, what does all this mean? Why am I mentioning all of these theories and interactions?
Yes.
And in fact, if you look at the history of the analysis of how the American Constitution, again, we're talking about American democracy, arose, there has been an evolution there. So about 100 years ago, there was the view that the economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States was the most logical, that in fact the colonies gathered together because there was a material interest in doing so. However, since that time, there has been much discovery and analysis of the interactions between, again, the Native American communities and cultures and the developing American colonies. And these are just 3 books that I will draw on, and a few others in the remaining comments that I have. So by Barbara Graymont and by Bruce Johansson and his co-author as well, David Grind. And just to, again, to frame this, this is from Jerome Brunner's The Notion of the Spiral Curriculum. And in fact, we see these feedback effects. So people, we're learning again by preparing a state of mind. We learn by reading. We learn then, of course, beyond reading by doing. And there's a feedback effect from the mistakes based on what we have assumed prior to doing that influences and informs our thinking on a particular topic. So again, there's this circular or the spiral feedback that you see in the interaction between American colonists and native tribes. But anyway, so Grind and Johansson argue that colonial Americans, early colonial Americans, viewed American society not as some distinct European transplant, but in fact as a synthesis of Native American and European cultures. So you have examples like everyone knows Tammany Hall, but the Tammany society on which this notion was based is for them a classical example of the blending of these two cultures. And even with phenomena like the Tammany Day, which is a kind of a mix of May Day, the European tradition, and other holidays with the American environment, are for them examples of this. So, in fact, in the Tammany Society, which many influential Americans belonged to, the American Indians were seen not only as a symbol, some kind of archaic notion that we give lip service to, but to members of the society in this first generation, the revolutionary generation, the American Indians, in fact, represented, as they argue, a wellspring of new ideas that freed Europeans from the antiquated ideas of class and autocratic government that had so long existed in Europe. So, in fact, there was this constant interchange, and the leaders sought to study American Indian languages and ideas to inform their own new country. And as you see, of course, there is the imagery on the left here. You see Franklin and other founding fathers meeting with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, at their tree where the hatchet, so to speak, was buried in the Haudenosaunee Confederation that I'll get to just in a moment. And at the bottom, you see the first seal of the United States of America. And in the left talon of the eagle, which is on our right side, you see these 13 arrows, which is a direct transplantation of the symbol of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, which were 6 arrows. And at the time, many American colonists thought of actually just using the 6 arrows. They decided it would be inaccurate since there were 13 colonies, but the imagery is there nonetheless. So as I mentioned, the Haudenosaunee are one of the largest inspirations for the founding fathers, as one says. And in fact, as Johansson and Grind argue, the Iroquois, which the French referred to the Haudenosaunee as, these were natives around the area of New York, and in the southern parts of Canada, Ontario, this region in general. So they believe that the spiritual power of one person is limited, but when combined with other individuals in a hearth, in what they called an otiana or a clan, the spiritual power is enhanced. And they lived in these long houses, as you see here. And many of the founding fathers, again, spent time, this founding generation, I would say, they were founding mothers as well. They spent time in these longhouses, which if you look inside of this picture on the top right, you see there are multiple families sharing a single dwelling, and the hearth, the fire in the center, was a place of social exchange. In fact, people were learning how to do democracy in the home, and then, of course, beyond the home, in the village itself. So you're scaling these important interactions and socializing a deliberative culture. So in fact, when a person died in their culture, the public power was considered to be diminished. So it was very important for them, this idea of the clan, of the social. So the individual was not necessarily the center of the polity. In fact, the civilization was matrilineal. Men traveled to the tribe of their wives. And in fact, the representatives, you could say, the Congress, if you could call it that, and the representatives themselves were called sachems. And in fact, there are a number of sports teams still in New England called the sachems. And of course, a reference to the Haudenosaunee tribes. So they were in fact nominated by the clan mothers. So the women nominated the representatives. And they could also then remove or impeach a sachem that was found guilty of a number of abuses of office I don't need to get into. So again, all of these things were actually observed by people like Jefferson and others and influenced their thinking. And in fact, I'll make one more observation that the sachems were not allowed to name their successors. So there was no legacy, and you were not able to carry the title to the grave. And in fact, so this was a very meritocratic institutions. The guarantee of freedom of religion and so on were very much important in the Haudenosaunee culture, and in fact, forbidding the unauthorized entry of homes. So all of these things might sound familiar to you if you reflect on the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. So in fact, just one other comment on the Haudenosaunee, they had a federation, of course, of the 5 and then later 6 tribes that was promulgated and inspired by Hiawatha, one could even say statesman, and I believe he was Oneida. Yeah, and my partner shaking is nodding his head. I'm right. And the origins of this league arose, in fact, out of the desire to resolve conflict. So it was the problem of the blood feud. So while families had conflicts, they dealt with them individually, an eye for an eye, as you're seeing now in Gaza, for instance, and that did not serve well for peace. So in fact, as long as justice and the monopoly on violence resided in the clans, there was no hope for peace and goodwill. So in fact, there was this fantastic meeting of the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawks, and they ended up burying the hatchet. This is where the phrase comes from. They buried their tools and implements of violence under a tree that in fact became the symbol of the peace between these tribes. And the symbol that you see representing the Onondaga represents both the peace and this chain of connection, connecting basically these different tribes. So the procedure for deliberating policies once this confederacy was born is very interesting, and it began with the Mohawks and the Senecas, considered the elder brothers who would deliberate amongst themselves, in reference to some particular policy. And after they debated, they sent this to the keepers, what was called they sent them to the across the fire. It was sent to the Oneida and the Cayuga, who were the younger brothers of the smaller tribes, who discussed much in the same manner. And once they were satisfied, they would then send this to the Senecas and the Mohawks again to confirmation. And next, the question was laid before the Onondaga tribe for their decision. So you see this federalism, this idea of power that is not centralized, but that is placed at that level where it is the most reflective of the needs of the society. And so they permitted the maximum freedom to nations within the confederation and individuals within the nation. There's always this emphasis on balance of powers. I don't have much time to get into other Native American tribes, but I just wanted to mention a few of the southeastern tribes who were also very influential in founding the United States. And these quotes are taken from a book by Dwayne Champagne called Social Order and Political Change, about exactly the 5, or one could say 6, southeastern nations, as the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Creek, and the Seminole, of course, are the 6 that split from the Creek. But anyway, says that, so this is still from Grein and Johansson. They observe that travelers in the 18th century observed that subjugation is what these nations are totally unacquainted with. This goes back to what I was saying about Ellerman's notion of translation versus concession. There being no such thing as coercive power among them. And another contemporary commented at about the same time, it is by native politeness alone that chiefs bind the hearts of their subjects and carry them wherever they will. Now, Champagne suggests—
Thank you.
Jerome, thank you. We will, Jerome will have his presentation up online, but could we go back to the last 4 slides of Lowell's presentation?
No, not the last ones.
I'm sorry,
Because
leadership.
I'm almost finished. Can I finish my presentation?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
This is just that I'm getting to the end. The 4
yeah.
Southeastern nations, they had democratic political cultures that emphasized egalitarianism, consensus, and non-coercive political leadership and accountability as well. So the point I think that is very important to make, and I'll try to close this off very quickly, is that it was decentralized and locally oriented, with the fundamental political unit being the village. And of course, just to remind you that in the United States Constitution, cities have no sovereignty. It is states. So in the Cherokee and the Creek society, it was very different. The village was the unit that had the power. They could form coalitions, but they could also abstain. So just to say again, this is basically the conclusion. The lessons are that we need to spiral back again to the earlier stages of the American experiment, find a way to balance collective and individual freedom, using notions like subsidiarity, and in fact observe the fact that the natives abhorred greed and accumulation, and institutions like the Tammany Society, in fact, did seek to find ways to merge these two cultures. And so again, this is the last slide. Can a more fundamental dialogue, as I ask with the Indigenous critique, help Americans rediscover a path forward? And this is
Well-
just a book I'm editing currently, where some of these questions are dealt with, and my email address for anyone who has any further questions.
Thank
or
you,
comments.
Jerome. Thank you very much. And I am going to,
Jerome, you have a appreciative audience here. Thank you.
they're clapping.